Alrighty, we're gonna get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome. You're in the right place. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to remove one distraction, and this could be closing the door, minimizing a window, turning off your phone, pausing your inbox. This is the second webinar in the Smart Strategies series for virtual workplace. Today's topic is scaffolding the new virtual workplace. My name is Raven Rankin, and I'm the manager of client experience at the Nebo company. I'm also your host for today's webinar. The Nebo company is a leadership development firm located in Washington, D.C. and Atlanta. Nebo works at the intersection of leadership, strategy, leadership development, and culture, providing coaching, team coaching, and leadership development. We are known for strategic vision and planning, as well as culture change work. Today, we are delighted to share insights from more than 16 years of coaching with leaders. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a few basic instructions on how to interact with the webinar today. And I'd like to also say that the Nebo company is named after a lake in the Adirondacks. And so any picture that you see with the lake is from the actual Lake Nebo. So during today's webinar, we will invite you to participate in a group poll. Please do so. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions anytime during the webinar, feel free to write it in the Q&A function or the chat in your Zoom window. Margo will be answering them at the end. If you need help troubleshooting anytime during the webinar, please feel free to send me a private chat or email me directly at rrankin@nebocompany.com. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing it with you afterwards. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Margo Street is a Vice President of Client Experience at the Nebo company, as well as a leadership facilitator. Margo works closely with clients to identify the best approaches for their leadership development priorities and supports Nebo staff and diverse, dynamic facilitators in delivering a superb client experience. Margo facilitates on leadership topics such as leading change, culture, and values development, collaboration, strategic planning, and team building. Without further ado, Margo.
Thank you so much, Raven. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you, working from my home in Cheverly, Maryland, just outside of the Washington, D.C. area, and talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So with a background in psychology and business and anthropology, organizational culture is really where my passions meet. I will say that I've got some kids in the background and husband and all of that fun stuff here at home. So hopefully it'll be pretty quiet, but I'll request any grace if you hear any background. So, long before COVID-19 was dominating all aspects of our lives, we've known that building organizational culture takes intentionality. And yet, because we're so often operating in business as usual, we don't tend to give culture the attention it deserves, or we find that people are resistant to new behaviors that have really the potential to transform culture. And well, right now, it's not just business as usual. People are willing and hungry to engage in new ways. And so there's a unique opportunity right now to build an intentional culture as we're rapidly redefining a new way of being together. And what's more is that the structures that we are putting in place now will lead to a new culture taking root, not just during, but also beyond this pandemic. It's really critical to be intentional right now. And this is when mission, culture, values are going to count the most. So with that, and we're going to get right into it, but it's been nice to sort of see you, but I'm going to turn my video off now so we can all focus on the content. And we'd like to kick it off with a poll. We'd like to hear from you about what's been hard over the past few weeks as you've moved into a virtual workplace. What have been causes for breakdowns? there we go.
So you can now participate in the poll. You'll have 30 seconds to do so. In the past few weeks, what have been the most common causes of breakdown in the virtual workplace? There's screen fatigue, too much communication, too little communication, distractions, social disconnection, ineffective remote meetings, issues with technology platforms, being plugged in 24/7, inability to monitor others, erosion of trust. We're going to give you about 10 more seconds to do so, and then we're going to close it. Alrighty, I'm going to share the results. As you can see, screen fatigue is the top contender. 68% people have said that. And then we have distractions coming in second, along with being plugged in. Erosion of trust, 0%. So that's great to see. Margo, do you have any additional thoughts and insights on these results?
Thank you. It's really interesting to see them. Interesting that screen fatigue had the most responses. Not surprising, but I guess it's, seeing this is probably a good reassurance to remember that you're not alone in this. I am surprised about some of the ones that were lower, which is great. Ineffective remote meetings has not been a breakdown. That's awesome. That's a really good sign, right? Because our meetings are where so much work happens. And people feeling that there is a little too much communication. Okay, that's expected. We've had a lot of email overload. But as we'll talk about here, too little communication is perhaps the larger problem. So it's good to see that that's not been a major breakdown. Distractions, we know distractions are an issue. So yeah, and this being plugged in, right, it feels like it's really hard to turn off right now. So thank you so much for sharing those. We can close out the poll there. And really, what we hope that you and your teams will be able to do is translate these breakdowns and create breakthroughs. Since we simply aren't business as usual operations, we're observing among ourselves and also among our clients that people are granting new levels of grace as we make this shift to the new reality. Now is a time for rapid learning, for iteration, for adaptation. It's a time for showing vulnerability in order to engender trust. It's a time to really be able to tackle longstanding issues like ineffective meetings or lack of flexible work arrangements, things that maybe could be tackled head on in a way they couldn't have before, taking breakdowns and turning them into breakthroughs. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. And we'd like to offer 4 components that taken together can lay the groundwork for your virtual culture. First, taking the time to explicitly discuss how your team or your organization is going to shift behaviors in the virtual workplace. So redefining norms and agreements. Next, this is about making virtual culture building the work of someone's actual job by actually identifying champions for the virtual culture. Third is establishing predictable routines in order to set up that scaffolding for these new structures that you're putting in place. And finally, give attention to keeping teams and then in turn the organization intact. So while there's an upfront investment that's required to get the virtual workplace launched, this is not something that's a one and done situation. This is something where intentionality must continue over time as you experiment and recalibrate continuously. So before diving into each of these components a bit deeper, excuse me, we want to remind you that how you are is just as important as what you do during this transition. So with that, we encourage you to take this concept of a coach approach as you build your virtual culture in the weeks ahead. At Nebo, what this means is using deep listening and inquiry It also means giving people the space to show up as their whole selves. A coach approach means holding others accountable with compassion and remembering that actually contributing at work at a time like this, really contributing productively, can be a source of great pride and also fulfillment during in certain times like this. So it can be really mutually beneficial to hold people accountable. Excuse me. So starting with the basics, you have to define which technology platforms will serve your virtual workplace. And this is something that there's a lot of resources on out there, right? So we're not going to dive too deeply into it. Excuse me. So sorry, I'm hearing that there's a little trouble hearing me, so I'm going to try to speak up a bit. Consider, as you're going through the technology platforms, the different ways that we're working together. So there's all these different ways we're working together, and you want to look at them and then settle on the suite of tools that best fit your organization's priorities and culture. So think about the ways that we're hanging out digitally, side by side. Thinking about the ways that we're collaborating electronically, including shared calendars and project management tools. And think about how many face-to-face meetings we're on, right? Here we are together on Zoom. So thinking about those and finding the suite that works best for you. From there, it's important to be explicit about how your staff should communicate and collaborate. This is really about removing that ambiguity that really so often surrounds workplace communication by providing clear guidelines, which we recommend are actually even written or recorded, and that outline what kinds of messages should be sent through which different mediums and how team members are expected to interact with each other. Here are some ways to think about redefining norms. And one of the most important ones is that first one around meetings and updates. People feel close when communication is predictable. So that doesn't necessarily mean fast or perfect, but predictable communications. That brings a proximity and a closeness to people. This also relates to responsiveness. So you want to revisit, reconfirm your agreements around when and how to respond to one another and external parties. I'll also point to this concept of the virtual water cooler, which is actually, it's one of the most overlooked aspects of virtual cultures. Yet it's imperative that in any type of virtual workplace, we make room for personal non-work interactions, and especially so right now, given the sense of isolation that so many people are experiencing. And I know this can feel really hard when our kids and our pets and our partners and our neighbors and so many people need our attention. Yet if many opportunities for informal connection are created, there will be at least some small ways for each person in the organization to engage at this level and to be able to feel connected and maintain trust throughout this season. So I want to real quickly just share a little bit about Nebo's sort of launch of our virtual culture. On our team's last day in the office before going fully remote, we hosted a launch meeting and we agreed to some really explicit norms, and some of them were loosely in place and we firmed them up, and some were new. So we agreed to set up a group text via the GroupMe app. We made the agreement to default to use video in our meetings so that we are able to capture the nonverbal cues, but we also agreed to again, grant grace and give each other the option to just be on the phone to get a break, because it can be quite intensive to be on video so much. Another agreement was always having a co-pilot for important meetings or presentations, like Raven is for me today. We committed to making our calendars, which we already shared, keeping them really detailed and honest and updated so that we know what one another is up to during the week. We agreed to call each other more on the phone. We also agreed to continue celebrating together, birthdays, holidays, happy hours. And finally, we agreed to assume good intent, this important idea that in this time we're adjusting, we're all experiencing this season in a different way, and to come at it really assuming good intent and using inquiry versus assumptions. So that's just a little bit about how our team really explicitly thought about norms and agreements as we launched into this new virtual workplace. And so moving into the next one, because scaffolding the virtual workplace is not a one-time task, it's important to have champions who can carry forward the culture torch. First and foremost, the company leader is a champion for the new culture just by default, right? So it's important that they model the new way of working. And so that's a given, it's important, not always easy. From there, we encourage you to both identify and empower one or more team members from across the organization as culture champions. They don't just need to be from HR. You want to really think about the opportunity this could present for somebody who is a rising leader, somebody who's maybe a junior staff, somebody who's got a lot of energy, someone whose job has changed significantly given the recent shifts in the workplace. So it can be a really fulfilling and great growth opportunity for somebody or several people. And when you're thinking about who to bring in as a culture champion, you want to look for people who others naturally follow. They're energetic, persuasive through their words and their actions. One thing that's worth noting here is they don't have to be extroverts to be effective in this role. And depending on the culture of your organization, you'll need to think about that. Champions must exhibit empathy. That's important no matter what they're like, is that they're understanding that just because they're charging forward with culture change with lots of enthusiasm and ease potentially, it doesn't mean that others will be able to do so as quickly or easily. So there's an empathy piece that's really important. The people who are champions are consistently demonstrating behaviors that are in line with your organization's values. And you also want to look for the people who can potentially be navigating politics with maturity and diplomacy. Okay, so with norms redefined, champions identified, there's a unique opportunity now to seize this business as sort of unusual moment to nurture new habits that may not have been possible in the sort of previous status quo context, right? So it's again, that opportunity to tackle issues head on and create these new behaviors. So establishing consistency and routines is so important as you're striving to turn behaviors into habits and thus shifting culture, because really culture is a set of consistent behaviors over time. So here are some practical tips that we've been putting in place and that we've been encouraging our clients to try out in the weeks ahead. We'd also love to hear from you about other routines that you're putting in place in your virtual workplaces. So while we invite you to share your ideas in the chat box, I'll call attention to the first tip here, intentional openings and closings. So here are some examples of what that can look like. And these can be both to days and to meetings. So consider one-word check-ins at the start of meetings, right? How are you showing up to this meeting? How are you doing today? Or, what's your mood? And then also with a quick fist to five about how effective the meeting was. Now, fist to five just means people literally hold up, at the video camera, their fists and put up fingers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers, with 0 being this was not a great virtual meeting. 5, maybe this was a dynamic, productive, and efficient meeting, and everything in between. So it's a way to kind of see how are we doing as we move along in this journey toward virtual habits. Another idea for opening an intentional opening and closing is doing a mood check at the start and end of each day. This could be, done via a group text, for example. And this helps to create connection and also to foster self-awareness. We have an opportunity to be honing our emotional intelligence skills um, really intentionally in this moment. And one more idea around an intentional opening and closing is asking people to send their top priority for the day in an email or text, and then reporting back at the end of the day. How do they do on their top priority? You know, where are they getting stuck? Where they make progress? This can be an accountability measure, but it's also just again around motivation, connection, and staying, you know, abreast of one another's work. And so with that, I'm going to go over to the chat box for a moment, see if any other ideas have come in. We've got somebody who said that we had a virtual happy hour on Zoom that went really well. Love it. Somebody else said we're looking at adjusting meetings to 4 days a week, or figuring out ways to clear calendars a little more so there's space to deal with life. I love that idea. So having maybe like meeting free Monday or meeting free whatever day for people to be able to do concentrated work or potentially attend to the other people who they're living with, or you know, health issues, right? So that's a really great idea. I love that one. We may have to steal that one. Another person suggested leaving your desk during breaks, or getting active during breaks to create energy. And I know that comes from someone who's got a lot of experience being a virtual employee. Somebody else shared that I'm in my current role, I'm not the leader of the primary team I engage with. And this difficult time has held a silver lining, a sense of urgency that has driven a lot more efficiency and results. My hope for the team is that post-COVID, they can keep that sense of attending to important items, even when they are no longer urgent. It's a great example of how our habits right now may be able to translate into really our DNA into the future. I love this one. Do something mindless during breaks to combat fatigue. I love it because we're focused a lot on mindfulness, but doing something really mindless and just letting go, releasing, is a really great way to kind of re-energize. Somebody suggested that they're using Slack for these kind of virtual water cooler chats, sharing memes and things like that. People talked about meditation and taking meals, transitioning between work and quote unquote home, which is an important thing when you're at home all the time, and taking long walks to offset the sitting and the walking you used to do around the office. And lastly, we heard, these are great ideas. I love these. Giving grace to myself and others for the few minutes of interruptions when a child needs attention, because I would do the same if I was interrupted by a coworker in my physical office space. So yes, we've really allowed each other to show up as whole people and to grant grace as we deal with the background noise, the interruptions, things like that. Thank you so much for sharing these great ideas. And, you know, really, I'll just say the power of rituals should not be underestimated. Get creative about how your team or your organization cultivates new habits at this time. And here's just a little sneak peek at a week in the life of Nebo's virtual workplace. So you'll see we've started to come up with a nice cadence. Our CEO, Kate Ebner, is on Zoom every morning for a virtual coffee for whoever wants to show up. This is a time for informal connection, so we're not working when we're there, and we leave that for the staff huddles. Raven, who's one of our virtual culture champions, she's helped to set up a rhythm for us. And you can see some of that here. We have fun daily group texts, and that fosters employee engagement. We have periodic happy hours, like other people mentioned. And we've had fun themes and games. We played Name That Tune, which was actually really fun. And we're talking about things like Jeopardy and karaoke during our happy hours. Some people, some of the colleagues here at Nebo are participating in parallel work sessions during which colleagues can work side by side together virtually, as they might have done informally and naturally in the office. We also have several optional lunch convenings, virtual lunches each week that allow us to really break bread together, and that helps to build connectivity and trust among our team. We our team is seeing that these new routines are really leading to a dynamic culture in this moment, and we feel that it will likely become part of our DNA for the long term beyond the current crisis. So it feels like a good, silver lining again in all of this. So the final component of the 4 is about going back to the basics. With all that has changed, what's interesting is what makes an effective and cohesive team really has not changed. Many of us are familiar with Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team and what the 5 behaviors are for a cohesive team. And these are as important as ever, as we're aiming to keep our teams and in turn our organizations intact. Now, granted, these behaviors may look and feel different in the virtual workplace. And so here's a look at how we can attend to each of the 5 dysfunctions in the virtual context. I'll zoom in on the 2 foundational behaviors, trust and conflict, for just a minute. So at this time, genuine transparency and honesty, which of course can be difficult when communication is happening through technology, but those form the basis of trust. So that transparency, that honesty. This trust can be rebuilt in the virtual context through intentional team building based on vulnerability and really diligent attention to how team members are interpreting one another's thoughts. So beginning this process or re-beginning this process in a virtual context means intentionally discussing the fact that miscommunications or different agendas or internal problems they're going to happen, and that we need to be able to address them and manage them as they arise. Trust building right now is more nuanced and also more mission critical than probably ever before. It's not easy to build it, but it's important. And without a strong sort of vulnerability-based trust, teams find it more challenging to debate constructively about ideas or to bring up alternate solutions. We know that productive conflict is part of what makes teams more effective than, let's say, a single person working on their own. This is why we have teams. And this productive discourse that's so important to team effectiveness and organizational effectiveness, now it has to happen during conference calls, during virtual chats, during video meetings. In a virtual context, that means we're going to have to be really thoughtful about which of the highly complex or emotionally charged conversations that we'll bring up, as well as when and how we bring them up, since we don't have that time or that opportunity to just sort of walk to people's offices and follow up after the meeting as you might do in the office. But you can bet that your organization will need to be skilled at engaging in productive conflict in the weeks and months ahead as we face so many challenges. So, allowing people to disagree in order to really sharpen their thinking it's a positive thing. We know this from so much research, but it's often really scary for us to do that. So one way to foster a sense of psychological safety is for a team leader to intentionally generate or model debate and critical thinking, always focusing conflict on the work itself, not anything personal. Knowing that the key for productive conflict in a virtual setting is to be explicit about norms and expectations. And then a key here is to practice. Instead of avoiding conflict, how can we practice it? Because virtual conflict, it's not something that comes naturally to most of us. So those are really the 2 foundational pieces. Before we move on from this, I'll mention a tip for ensuring commitment on virtual teams. Commitment's really about buy-in. And so a good practice is to transparently state to the full group what has been decided and give the same updates to everyone versus trying to address concerns or give updates on an individual by individual basis. This leads to greater buy-in and in turn to greater accountability and results. And then also, just remembering that goal setting, clear communication, and recognition of jobs well done are just as important for virtual teams as they are for in-person, non-remote teams. So this is about going back to the basics, being intentional, bringing intentionality to what keeps our teams effective and cohesive. And this can't hurt you to hold on to for beyond this pandemic. So those are the 4 components, which if taken together and continuously tested and revisited, we believe will help you build an intentional virtual culture for your team, your organization. And before we move on to questions, just a few more tips on turning your virtual breakdowns into cultural breakthroughs. So I referenced this earlier on, but really now is that time to ground in your mission, vision, values, because this creates clarity and that supports decision-making, norming, teaming, productivity. And again, clarity in a time like this feels challenging, but is important to find places for that. And your culture and your values can really provide that, even though there's uncertainty about the future. Also erring on the side of over communication. So this relates back to that the poll we did, and we saw a little bit more of the over communication as a breakdown versus the under communication. And I would say that that's a good thing, because even though we're inundated and perhaps overwhelmed by emails and resources and updates, it's better to put the information out there and trust that others will sift through what is most relevant for them, versus taking the risk of under communicating and really excluding, isolating people at this time. Excuse me. Also, right now, the status quo has flown out the window. So it's a time where everything, even those long-standing taboos that no one's been willing to address, could be put on the table. It's a moment to question the way we do things around here. And for many of us, I have got a practical little tip here, because we may find it, difficult to find motivation or concentration with so much going on around us. So for those times, if you haven't heard of it, I recommend trying out the 5-second rule. It's a concept introduced by Mel Robbins. Basically, this is a rule that says that if you have an instinct to act on a goal, you must physically move within 5 seconds or your brain will kill it. This looks at neuroscience and the fact that your brain will come up with a barrage of thoughts and excuses if you don't take swift action. So if you find yourself procrastinating or you've been distracted and again, try honing your focus by counting down. This is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and tell yourself go, and then you start. You can Google it to learn more. I found that this is helpful, and I actually am hoping to bring it to incorporate it with my kids in my new role as a homeschooler. And then last, but also not least, and something that we've really been trying to support you on in multiple ways is remembering to pause, to breathe. So I'll turn my video back on now. So as we get to closing out and questions, but really I hope that you'll take away with you this message, that right now it's not just business as usual, as I've said, and people are willing and hungry to engage in new ways. So while there isn't a silver bullet to building a good virtual culture, what we know for sure is that it takes attention and intention, and that the structures that you put in place now will impact your organization for years to come. So with that, I would love to open it up to any questions that have come in. Raven, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. So someone said, I found that some things work for a bit, then lose effectiveness. My sense is this happens faster in the virtual environment. What's the best way to surface these and adjust quick enough to keep pace?
That's a great question. I think the key here, this really gets to these pieces of I would say that champions and routines are the keys to that um, sustaining momentum, right? So the champions are the ones whose job it is, right? They're sanctioned. It's not just a fun to do, but they're sanctioned and needed to keep things fresh, to keep ears to the ground, to say what's working, what's not, and how do we recalibrate. But also the establishing routines, which is baking in regular touch points, right? So having that in the calendar, baked in, and if fatigue sets in on a certain thing, well, maybe it's how do we don't want to let go of this important routine, but do we want to evolve it, right? So that's that experimentation and recalibration, and so a feedback loop is super important. That's what I'd say there. And if others have ideas, we welcome your thoughts in the chat box as well.
So a second person loved the 5-second rule and would love to know the person that created it.
Sure. It's Mel Robbins, Robbins. And trying to see where is it? Nope, I keep going past it. Sorry. Yeah, it's melrobbins.com. Yeah, and it's a really fascinating piece there. Any other questions?
Yes, we do have another one from Heidi. Are there any fears that the remote work environment would make more people want to continue working without coming into the office? At a university where I work, our residential high-touch environment is key to the mission, so we cannot really keep working remotely and be as effective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, I think there's the sense that it's a yes and. I think there are people who appreciate being in person more than they ever have before. I know we've talked to several people who have resisted remote work and either personally or organizationally, and then struck with it, found it to be, wow, really refreshing. This is great. We're learning so much. We can do more than we expected. And that's great. And there's going to be a lot of that, right? There will be shifts, I suspect, in how people work in that way, where employees will say, we showed we can do this. We showed we can be effective. How might we evolve given what we just proved that we could do? On the other side, I think there are people who have been remote or wished to be remote, who are in it and saying, wow, I miss being in the office. I miss the intensity of being home all the time, not getting out of the house, being on virtual calls all the time, not having the informal updates and connections and all of that. And so I think there may be, maybe if you look at it as like a pendulum swing, right? Maybe there will be a falling out where there is a demand from employees and a flexibility from employers to find that happy balance. And I think it's also going to be very different sector by sector, organization by organization, both based on the type of jobs and requirements, and also based on the culture. So I would say it's, let's not see it as a risk. Maybe we see it as probable, and about finding that sort of happy place, that sweet spot for the organization.
Perfect. We have one last question. Any recommendations on how to help a manager understand the reality and become empathetic for those staff who have to juggle their day job along with teaching or just being present with their children during this time? It's hard to be as productive as we were when working out of the office.
Yeah, I can say, as one of those working parents, it's really hard. Empathy is so critical like that. And so I think, for one thing, is I think we need to be really explicit about saying that to our managers and teaching it, right? And so this is something that Nebo be happy to support you on. But really teaching what it looks like to be empathetic, really making explicit to say, plan that, at the beginning of each meeting, you're going to ask about how things are going and where the struggles are, and things like that. So it's really explicitly, again, putting that in the responsibility of managers. I think one of the hardest things in this context is focused work periods. So it's one thing to kind of try to keep up with emails. That's difficult, but you can kind of, maybe get through a bunch of things. But if you really need to kind of dig in, I know that for a lot of the parents that I know, it means working outside of normal hours. So that may be something that is more possible with some, organizations and industries than others. But thinking about, okay, is it, if 8 hours needs to be put in, does it have to be put in between 9 and 5, or can it be put in at different times throughout the day? I think another tactic is for parents, if they're comfortable with it, and the managers, if managers feel comfortable with it, making it really, again, transparent and explicit in our calendars. So sharing calendars. This is something that I do, and my other teammates who are parents do, is we're putting in when we're sort of on duty fully, and when we can't really, be focused on work because we're focused on kids, and other times when we may be able to be really focused on work. So in that way, really being sensitive to those needs. There are a lot of resources. We can send some of those. There's some really good resources, not just for the parents, but for employers and managers who are managing people who are balancing this homeschooling and working full time. So we'd be happy to share some of those resources as follow-up to this session. It's a really important question, and probably a whole other webinar's worth of conversation.
Thank you, Margo, for answering those questions. I'd just like to point us into some additional resources that the Nebo company has to offer. We have a great article on 5 strategies for leading a virtual team. You can sign up to receive a daily piece of encouragement in your inbox. Sprint on, it gets really nice and light, especially during this time. And you can also sign up to receive our monthly newsletter, Lead Within. If you're interested in these items, we'll send you the links along with the recording afterwards. And we just also like to invite you to join us for our next webinar in the Smart Strategies for Virtual Workplace webinar series. The next one is on April 24th on the Chief Resilience Officer, which is you. And then another one on May 8th, the Insider's Guide to Leading in Uncertain Times. Without further ado, thank you so much, everyone. If you have any additional questions, thoughts, or insights, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you in 2 weeks.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today.